welcome to our live stream today, and a little different scenery than normal. I'm in Maui on a family vacation with my wife, and my parents are here, and so we're all here in Maui, but we didn't want to stop the regularly programmed live stream, wanted to stay as consistent as possible. So we're here. It's 10:30 in Maui, 3 hours before California time, and having a great time. But hopefully, we'll have a great time here too, talking about advanced signal paths. And let us know where you're chiming in from. We see we've got some people from the UK. We got some people from Wisconsin. We got all sorts of folks. So thank you for being here, and we'll get right into it. And also, just as a disclaimer, we got our giveaways going. We got a few giveaway items available today, and this will kind of happen throughout the course of the live stream, where we'll break about every 8 minutes or so, and we'll ask a question that had to do with this week's video. And if you answer that question correctly and you're the first person to do so, you'll win one of these items. So we have assorted picks from Diodario. You'll sort of get a potpourri of picks from Diodario if you answer some questions right today. We also have some capos from Diodario, which are great capos, the Pro Plus. We have two of these to give away. We also have the True Tone current reader, which is a great way to determine whether your pedals are the right amount of current for your power output, so that you're not overloading any output, and you can see exactly how much they draw. And sometimes there'll even be some surprises. Some pedals might say that they draw more, but in actuality they may draw less. This will help you determine that. And we also have a True Tone one-spot individual wall wart power supply. This can be good just to kind of power some individual pedals or test some things out. It's just good to have a wall wart around just in case. So this can be a great thing to fulfill that need if you ever just need a standalone unit. So all these are going to be available today. We got somebody coming in from Ireland. Hey, Kevin. So we'll get right into it. So to this last video, and I'll put the thumbnail up on the page here, was about understanding advanced signal paths, and in particular looking at four cable method, which is abbreviated as 4CM, and wet dry wet, abbreviated as WDW. And we also even got a little bit into talking about noise gates as well, because that was something that we didn't talk about in our previous video that was about sort of just signal path basics, presuming that you're running everything in front of an amplifier all in mono. So let's just kind of do a quick refresh on signal paths, just starting with the easy stuff, and then we'll work into some of these more advanced versions of signal paths. And if you have any questions throughout this, please put those in the chat, and I will do everything that I can to get to those as we kind of go through these different questions, and these different signal paths, and we'll be able to get to your questions as they come in. So make sure that you're putting those in there now so that we have plenty of time to answer them. So let's start with our timer firstly, because every 8 minutes we're going to do a giveaway. So in about 8 minutes we'll do our first giveaway question, and then let's start with the basic signal path diagram. So let me blow this thing up, and we can see our full signal path here. So this is sort of my proposed signal path, not necessarily gospel, but this is just sort of one approach that I think for the majority of us is going to sort of be roughly where we would want to put these sorts of items. So you can see in the bottom right, it starts with the guitar. The guitar then comes into the impedance-sensitive pedals. So these are usually categorized as things like vintage fuzzes, wahs, treble boosters, octave fuzzes, things that usually use silicon or germanium transistors in them. These are things that will want to see a guitar directly as possible, and if there's a buffer before them, it can really affect the way that they sound. If you don't have any of these devices, then I would say go directly into your input buffer. Otherwise, put them first and then hit your input buffer, as we've shown here with the Mesa Boogie High Wire. Then it goes into what I call dynamic pedals. These are pedals that the response is dictated by the input signal and your dynamics. So these are things like compressors. These are things like POGs, OC2s, envelope filters. These are all things that are dynamically triggered. This could also be something like a whammy. All things like that would kind of fall into this category. Following that, then I would go into distortion and overdrive. And distortion and overdrive I typically categorize as I prefer to have lower gain things closer to the guitar, and then I go in, or I'm sorry, I go higher gain, highest gain close to the guitar, lower gain furthest from the guitar. And there's some contingencies there. Sometimes if you have an amplifier in a box or something like that, you might want to use that more like an amp and put it after some of these devices. But typically the reason why I say to do it in this way with higher gain closer to the guitar is because if it's already pretty high gain and you're slamming it harder with more gain, there's kind of a threshold of how much you can reasonably overdrive it anymore where it still sounds good and it doesn't just sound like a square wave mess. So I think that that's typically the way that I go. Then I might go into some sort of EQ, then into a clean boost, then into volume, and then I go into modulation. Now some modulation can be before overdrive, some can be after. Typically ones that I think sound better before are things like univibes, flangers, phasers, and stuff that I think typically sounds better after. Things like vibrato, chorus, tremolo, things like that I think typically sound better after overdrive. And then in the end, I like to go to delay and reverb, and then the output buffer. And one contingency that I talked about is that I actually like to put reverb before delay. And the reason why I like to do that is that I like to have reverb on every one of my delay trails. And typically your delay trails, unless you have a really short slapback, are going to be longer than the reverberation of whatever you set your reverb time to be. So by putting the reverb first, it's going to be printed on every single delay trail, and I think that that is a better sound. Now, some people have put reverb last because they want it to resemble more like what reverb would sound like in a Fender amp, where that would be after everything. But I think in terms of like a studio sound, most people would usually put reverb into delay on a lot of the mix buses and things like that when they're organizing these sorts of effects. So that's kind of a generalized overview of kind of signal path, assuming you just have a single amp, everything in mono. If you have any questions about kind of what I discussed, please do put those in the comments, and we will get to those as we go. But I want to kind of now up the ante and talk about if you had an amplifier that had an effects loop and you were going to utilize that as a part of your signal path. So I have a cool little diagram here that shows kind of the departure for the forward cable method following the overdrive and boost style pedals. So let's take a look at that and kind of recap, and then we'll do our giveaway in about 3 minutes. So we're going to pretend I'm going to move our giveaway piece down so that we can have that out of the way. All right, so roughly the same sort of signal path. The guitar is coming into the impedance-sensitive devices. We've kind of abbreviated some of those pedals, not because the same pedals don't exist, but we just don't have enough room to put everything that we put in the last one, so you're going to have to kind of use your imagination that the wah, the treble boosters, the octave fuzzes would all kind of fall under that impedance-sensitive area. Buffer would be after that. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the last video was about tuners. Now, tuners, if they're true bypass, it really doesn't matter where they go. But I would say if they are buffered, I would definitely put it after the high quality input buffer, just because we don't want that to be affecting anything else. And ideally, if the input buffer has some sort of tuner out, I would actually put it in the tuner out of your input buffer if it exists, just so that's just one less thing that you have in your signal path, and you can keep the signal path as clean as possible. Still looks the same here, dynamic pedals, so this would also encompass things like envelope filters, compressors, things like that. You have your overdrive and distortion, your boost and EQ, volume pedal. Now this is where, starting at the volume pedal, you could start to add these things to the effects loop. We put them in series in front of the amp, but these could all have cases to say that they would go into the effects loop. So if you put the volume pedal in the location that we have it here, it's generally going to, it's just going to be as though you put a volume pedal before a distortion device. If you have a high gain device like this Soldano amplifier, it's essentially the same as putting a volume pedal before a distortion pedal, because the Soldano is generating the distortion. For that reason, people that want to use a volume pedal as a master volume will put it as the first thing after the send generally, so that they can cut off the volume. Now the challenge there is that a lot of the volume pedals that we ordinarily use in front of the amp are not always compatible with the effects loop, because they require a much lower impedance typically. So most Ernie Ball volume pedals that you'd buy would normally be a 250K volume pedal. In this case, in most instances, you're going to need a low impedance volume pedal, so a 25K version. So Ernie Ball calls this their active volume pedal, even though it's passive, or Boss refers to it as their L version, which is low impedance. You could also make a case for boost going there as well, or EQ going there as well. A lot of people would use EQ in amps with effects loop that only had one shared EQ between their overdrive and distortion channels. And so they would use the EQ to kind of goose the clean sound so they didn't have to adjust the EQ settings when they're going between their two channels. Boost could also go there if you want to use it as a master volume boost. Again, this is in the effects loop. If you want to just use that to add more output after the preamp section, hitting the power amp section more. Also variable could be things like chorus, flanger, univibe. Any of that stuff could go in the loop. Some people use that in the loop. I tend to like it in front of the amp, and my justification is guys like Hendrix were all in front of the amp guys. Guys like Eddie Van Halen in the early days were using vibe or phaser flanger in front of a Marshall that was cranked. So I usually think about those as sort of in front of the amp, but you could use them in the loop if you wanted, presuming that they're able to meet the impedance requirements and the level requirements that are coming out of the effects send. Equally, chorus and tremolo, you can make a case for either place, but some people do like those in the loop, some people like them in front, but you definitely want to hit a buffer going into the front of the amplifier, into the input, and you also want to make sure that you have a buffer going on the return of the amp effects loop. And then, of course, in the effects loop, I don't think that there's really much contention here. Reverb and delay would pretty much always be there all the time. Most people who have effects loops would be using those there. So that's kind of the rough kind of diagram in some variable stuff about where you could put things. But let's do our first giveaway, because we did run out of time on the giveaway clock. I'm going to move it back up to the corner here. And let's do our very first question. So the way that this will work, if you're not familiar with the giveaway process, is we put a question up on the screen. It has to do with what we were speaking about during the course of our video this week. And I'll put that up on the screen. You'll see it come up. And we'll then announce the winner. The first person that gets it correct will win this first item. So the question is, if you are using an impedance-sensitive device, where should they go in your signal chain? If you're using an impedance-sensitive device, where should they go in your signal chain? First person to answer this correctly in the chat will win. It looks like Be Real 14 got this one, and Be Real 14, you're going to get a free assortment of Diodario picks sent directly to your house. If you can get with Mejia, he's going to put his email address in the chat, and just email him with your contact info, your email address. You don't send your email address here. You can just email Mejia with your email address, your phone number, your mailing address, and we'll make sure that these get shipped directly to you by Monday. And I will restart the clock. If you didn't win this one, we're going to do another giveaway in 8 minutes. So no sweat if you didn't win this one. You'll have another opportunity to win another one. So we talked a little bit about effects loops and different things to use in the effects loop. I want to pivot, though, to 4-cable method using a noise gate, because that was one thing that people talked about in our last video, the one that was on basic signal paths, and they said, well, what do we do if we have a noise gate? So typically, I'm going to show you two different ways to use a noise gate. One is going to be if you're using it in front of the amp, and one's going to be if you're using a 4-cable method. And I'm going to show you two different styles of noise gate. So one style is like the classic kind of decimator NS2. So this has an input, an output, a send, and a return. So it's got, almost like a 4-cable method within the actual device itself. And then there's another style, which is like what Fortin makes, which is a very popular noise gate as well, called a Zool, where that has what's called a key input. So it's basically getting a feed directly off of the input of the whole entire system, and then it has an input and output. So I'm going to show you kind of both styles so that you can know which way to use it depending on what it is that you have. So looking at kind of the ordinary decimator style or the Boss NS2 style, This is the one that has an input, output, send, and return. The question always is what are you trying to gate out? So are you trying to gate out amp noise? So you have a high gain amplifier like a Soldano and you need to remove noise from the preamp? Or is it pedals that are creating the noise floor? So the first way I want to show you is though the pedals are creating the noise floor. So in this situation, the guitar would go into whatever devices you want it to go through that are not creating the noise, and then it would go into the input of your decimator or your NS2. The send from the decimator or NS2 would go around your noisy effects pedal. So in this case, we're calling it a tube screamer and an SD1, and then it would return back into the decimator, again, because that's putting the noisy effects in its gate. And then on the output, it would continue to delays, reverbs, whatever things wouldn't ordinarily increase your noise floor. Usually the noisy effects are going to be your overdrive and distortion type devices. However, things like fuzzes and impedance sensitive stuff won't work great here because it will be low impedance and it will have some impact on it. So you really typically want to reserve this for overdrive distortion type pedals. And if you got a fuzz, you're really going to have to live with it. Otherwise, it's not going to sound particularly good if it's inside of the gate itself. So this is kind of how I would use a noise gate. I would use it around the noisy effects if you're talking about pedals that are creating the problem or the noise. But here's an alternative if it's the amp that's creating the noise. So it's you have a high gain amp like a Soldano or something like that that has a lot of noise because you're running it, really hot on the preamp, and it's a multi-channel amp, and you want to calm down kind of the noise when you go to the lead channel. So this is how you would do it. So the guitar would come into the noise gate. I know we're omitting some of the stuff that comes before it, but this would generally be sort of the last thing before you go in front of the amp. So guitar goes into the input of the noise gate. Send from the noise gate is going to go into the input of the amp. Then on the back of the amp in the effects loop, the send is going to go into the return of the noise gate. And then the output of the noise gate is going to feed your wet effects, your delays, reverbs, etc., and that's going to go into the return. So in essence, you're using the preamp of the amplifier as a pedal, where the input is the main input of the amp, and the output is the send out of the effects loop, which is essentially the preamp out. So in essence, you're treating the preamp section of the Soldano as its own pedal, so to speak, with an input and output, and you're building the gate around that so that you're able to gate that out. And if you had other distortion effects that were running in front of it, you could just put those on the send of the noise gate before it hit the input of the amp, and it would be comprised or gated in that loop. So you could do that as well if you wanted to. But I also want to show you this other alternative, which is using a Fortin Zool, which is a different style noise gate, which some people have. And so I wanted to make sure that we mention that as well. So the Fortin Zool has what's called a key input. And so this is why you see up front we have a buffer splitter here that's a SIR one. The reason why is that you need to be able to have the input signal feeding it all the time, and this is going to help trigger the gate properly so that it knows when to gate and when to not. So the key input is going off of the splitter, and also the other output is going directly into the front of the amp. And then the Zool is just the first thing in the effects loop right after the send, and then in the output of the Zool it feeds your wet effects, and then those go into the return. So this doesn't have kind of that send and return loop. What it's depending on is getting that input signal off of the guitar, and it knows that when the signal is going that the noise floor is going to raise, but it doesn't need to gate at that point because the output is going to sort of make up that difference. But then when there isn't any input signal, it knows it's going to gate out that sound so that you don't have any hiss or noise when there isn't signal that's running through the amplifier. So this is a different style gate, but I just wanted to show you both ways that you could run it. And if you're using a 4-cable method, or if you're using it for just pedals, or if you're gating out a preamp, or you're gating out pedals, or if you have an NS2 style or a decimator style versus the Fortin Zool style. So that's how you would do all of the kind of noise gating that you would want to do in either sort of scenario, whether that's in front of the amp, whether that's in the loop. So that should give you a pretty good sense of exactly how to do this. And I know we're a little ahead of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop the clock. We're going to do this giveaway now and then start getting into wet, dry, wet systems. And I'm going to show you both a traditional version and a more modern version using devices that you can find today that doesn't require that you get old rack units or old parallel mixers or anything like that. So I'm going to stop the clock and we'll do our next giveaway question. So question number 2, the way this is going to work, same way as last time. Question is going to come up on the screen. First person to answer it correctly in the chat wins. And we're going to be giving away a D'Addario Pro Plus capo, a wonderful capo. We use it on all of our instruments in the showroom, in my home studio, everywhere that there's a capo, we're using D'Addario. So great capo. I think you're going to enjoy it. Ship right to your house. Here's question number 2. Question number 2 is, when running 4-cable method, how many buffers would you ideally have in your rig? When running 4-cable method, how many buffers would you ideally have in your rig? First person to answer that correctly will win. And I think the first person to get this is John F. So it should ideally be 3, and I'll go back and I'll show you why. So you have your input buffer, that's 1. You have your output buffer going in the front of the amp, that's 2. And then you have a buffer on the return, that's 3. And we're presuming here that your amp effects loop is buffered. Hopefully it is, but in some cases they are not. But ideally, this would be how many you need for a 4-cable method. Ideally, you would want 3. So I'm going to go ahead and start the clock over again. If you didn't win, no problem, because we're going to be doing another giveaway in 8 minutes. Let's move on to wet, dry, wet. So I'm going to bring up our traditional wet, dry, wet diagram. Now, we don't have all rack units in here, but I think that the signal path of it will pretty closely resemble what a traditional wet, dry, wet rig would look like in the very classical sense. So let's go through this, and if you have questions, of course, put those in the chat, and we will get to those as we go. I'm going to move our giveaway. I'm going to make it a little smaller just so we can see everything. I'll move it down here. All right. So the giveaway timer is not part of the signal path. So guitar comes in, goes to the impedance-sensitive devices. Again, fuzzes, octave fuzzes, wah pedals typically. Then you hit your input buffer. Then you got your tuner. If you can put your tuner in a tuner out on an input buffer, that's good too. You got your dynamic pedals, your compressors, your Boss octaves, your whammies, things like that, compressors, envelope filters. Then you would go into some of your modulation devices, vibe, phaser, flanger, typically up front. Your overdrive and distortion. You could go into boost at this point after overdrive and distortion. Volume pedal, again, if you're using a high gain amplifier, there's a case to be made that you could put it after here, but this, I think it might be a little bit better place to put it in this particular scenario, because if you were to put it after the line out, it would only be affecting the wet part of the signal path. Then you have your output buffer that feeds the front of the amp. And then out of the back of the amp, out of the speaker out, you're going to be using a line out box, which is going to connect the dry amp cabinet and the speaker or the speaker jack on the back of your dry amp. So again, Soldano has a speaker jack. Your dry center cabinet has a speaker jack. Those are both connecting to the line out box. Here we have a SIR line out box. So basically what this is doing is tapping off of your output transformer, patting it down to line level. You have a level control on it so you can affect how hot the signal is that's sending to the wet devices. A lot of people would then use a parametric EQ if they wanted to EQ the wet signal a little differently. They might also use some compression if they wanted to have a little more bounce or kind of tightening effect. And then they would go into their stereo modulation from there, which would typically be the stereo split into the mixers. Now, in the old days, of course, they didn't have the parallelizers. They also didn't have some of these effects. We're just kind of using current day effects. Normally, in the old days, the parametric EQ would be like a Rain. The studio compressor would be a DBX 160X. The stereo modulation could have been a tri-stereo chorus or a TC Electronic 1210. and then it would go into normally a rain mixer. But for our purposes, this is just sort of giving you a visual representation of the signal path. Maybe don't place as much emphasis on any particular name brand of effects, but more just like what the effect does. So usually in mix 1, you would put your pitch shift and your reverb. And the pitch shift would ordinarily be set to a slight detune, usually -9, +9, left and right. And then also in that mix, you'd have your reverb. Well, in the old days, this would have been a lexicon typically, and the pitch would have been either an H3000 or something like an SPX 90. That mixer would then in stereo feed the second mixer, which would generally have the digital delays in it. And often there would be 2 digital delays in here because most of the ones that people used back then, like the Boss versions or some of the lexicons or even the TC Electronic 2290, those were mono delays. So they had to have 2 of them in order to get them in stereo. And then that would feed a stereo power amp, which would feed the left and right cabinets. And so you'd have a dry center that was all of the dry effects in front of the amplifier. That would feed the dry center. And then the line out would feed all of the wet effects and processing, and then those would go stereo to the left and right cabinets. So that's kind of a classical way of doing it. Again, we're showing some more modern pedals, but that would sort of be the ordinary classical way that you would run a wet, dry, wet rig. But I want to show you now how I would do a more modern take on it using a simpler signal path and fewer cabinets necessary. So pretty much everything in front of the amp looks the same. Guitar, impedance-sensitive stuff, buffer, tuner, dynamic pedals, some modulation, distortion overdrive, boost, volume, buffer in front of the Soldano. You're still the same up until the line out. You could use a parametric EQ. Some people, you could also make a case to put this in front of the amplifier as well, depending on kind of what you wanted to do. Your compressor, again, you could also make a case to put this in front of the amp, kind of depending on what your intent was. But I think you definitely would need your stereo modulation in this place. You're feeding the mix 1. This might have your pitch, your reverb. I threw some rotary in there because some people do really love rotary at 100% wet. Things like this parallelizer are cool though because you can blend in your dry signal. Another person also asked what if you wanted to go stereo into the parallelizer because it's only mono in stock. They are making a second version that is stereo in. You could also leave loop 1 always on and then have the return be the second input that would feed the rest of the loops if you wanted to have it stereo in. And then stereo out of the mixer would then feed your delay. If you want to do it kind of the old school Van Halen way, he was feeding the pitch and reverb in the mixer and then was feeding it into a delay that already had the dry signal in it. And then I would go into a stereo cab Zeus. And the cab Zeus can act sort of as your mic, your speaker, and your cabinet / power amp in a way. And this can then feed your front of house. So instead of having your left and right speaker cabinets on stage, this could be in your in-ears, or this could be coming through wedges, or however it is that you want to do it. It doesn't necessitate that you have 3 cabinets on stage. And so this can really free you up of a lot of space. You still have all the benefits of a wet, dry, wet rig, but you don't have to have 3 cabs on stage in order to make it happen. So I really like the cab Zeus for that because it is pretty linear. And typically the dry cabs were already pretty linear anyway. They had EVs or they might have maybe vintage 30s. They were typically close mic'd 112 Pacific cabinets. They weren't particularly amazing sounding cabinets. And so keeping it sort of linear using the cab sim, I actually think is a really good solution. It only requires you to bring 1 amp and cabinet or 1 combo amp, and then you can do the rest through the front of house or through your DAW or interface, which is a pretty cool alternative. So before we get into more of the signal path stuff, I'm going to cut us off slightly early and go directly to our giveaway and go to question number 3. So question number 3 is going to work the same way as it worked last time. The question is going to come up on the screen. First person to answer this correctly in the chat is going to win a milliamp reader from our friends over at True Tone. And this is a great unit because it not only tells you how much current your pedals are drawing, but it also doubles as a cable tester, which is a nice way to kind of troubleshoot some things if you think you might have a faulty cable. It's a good way to kind of get a quick read to see if you have an issue. So first person to answer this correctly will win. So here we go. Question is, in a traditional wet, dry, wet signal path, what effects are being controlled by the mixer? Now this is typically. There could be a variety of correct answers here, but which type of effects would you generally find in the mixers, the parallel mixers, that is? Because there's some wet stuff that won't be in the mixer. There's some things that will. And I think that the first one that we got correct here was Quinn Humphrey. Say hey, Mom.
Hey, Mom.
So Quinn, congratulations. Now there could be some other alternatives here, but let's just look back at it real quick. Typically in the mixer you find some pitch, which could be considered modulation, reverb, rotary, and then here's the more traditional one. You would find delay in there as well. So I think any combination of modulation, reverb, and delay would generally be the ones that you would want to have in there. So I think Quinn was the first that answered with that. So congratulations to Quinn. But if you didn't win, no problem, because I'm going to take it back to 8 minutes and we're going to do another giveaway in 8 minutes. So congrats. And let's now, we've gone through the wet, dry, wet. We've gone through 4-cable method. We've gone through the kind of very traditional style. So let's just go through and get through some of these questions that came in, and I'll try to answer as many as I can in the time that we have. We've been going for about 34 minutes, and I'll try to take this out to a full hour. And then if you're part of our supporting membership, either on Patreon or through the rigdr.com, we will then do our private stream to follow this. And if you're interested in the private stream, I should mention that you can go and sign up for that. You can, even at the lowest entry level into Patreon, which is I think $4.99 a month, you get access to free AMAs that we do after this. It's private for the Patreon group, in addition to people that are supporting members over on the rigdr.com. And if you can't afford any of those memberships, we offer a free version of the account, which you can request at any time. And there's no obligation to do anything other than just be a part of the community. And we grant 100% of those. There's no means testing or anything like that. You just request one and we give it to you. And the only thing that we ask is that if things change for you financially and you can afford the $5 a month, that you become a supporting member at that time. But until then, we don't want money to be standing between you and getting the sound that you hear in your head. So please feel free to ask for a free account. It's all anonymous. Nobody knows who's got a paid account, who's got a free account. It's all anonymized. So let's see. Let's see what we got today. All right, from Total Evo. If you were to put a noise gate in the VL loop, or maybe that's volume loop, on a switcher, what effect would it have, if any? The ISP Decimator Mini, one of my sound guys wanted me to have one for drives. Now I'm presuming that the Decimator Mini still has 4 jacks on it. So generally when you're using a noise gate in a switcher, the way that you would do it is guitar would come into the input of the noise gate first, before the switcher. The send of the noise gate would go into the input of the switcher. Then from your volume loop, the send of that would go to the return of the noise gate. And then the output of the noise gate would go into the return of the volume loop. In this way, assuming that it's a switcher where you can move the volume loop, you can then move it to be around any grouping of loops that you want, because it's in the volume loop, which is a variable position in most of these switchers, and it's started on the input. So you can move it around and gate it around whatever devices that you want. You could gate it around one overdrive device, you could gate it around multiple overdrive devices, depending on where you put it. So you would just simply move the volume loop after whatever effect you wanted it to enclose. And that would be how I would do it. Let's see. And also from Total Evo, why would you need an interface? Video for those that still connect cables in different places. I mean, I think that in sort of implicit in this question or this comment is sort of the reason that you want one. Is it eliminates the need to have cables coming out of everywhere, and so even a passive one will consolidate your connections. The other thing that it does, which I think is less talked about, is that it removes any wear and tear on the devices, and so you're not plugging and unplugging and stressing out any of the jacks on the pedals themselves. All the jacks on the pedals are sedentary and stationary, and the wear and tear is on the interface, which, if it's a passive one in particular, if something goes wrong, it's very easy to change a jack. You haven't destroyed your PCB or anything like that. Whereas if it's a pedal, it can sometimes be a little bit more problematic if the jacks are getting stress on them, or if somebody kicks a cable or pulls a cable, the stress is at the pedal. Whereas the interface can be a little bit more, can take a little bit more abuse, and it's easy to change jacks and things like that if you need to. Be Real 14 just wanted to say thank you for answering all my comments and questions. Sure. Well, hopefully I get to them all and make that true. Inexpensive amp cab switchers, 3 amps, 3 cabs. I think that the cheapest one that I'm aware of is probably the radial stuff, but I don't know how many they do. Also, Mesa Boogie has one now as well, and I think the Mesa Boogie one also has MIDI, so you can hook it up to MIDI and get it to trigger that way, which is pretty cool. But other than that, I don't know of a lot of them that do it. I've had the Kahayan one, but that's 8 heads into 4 cabs, I think. So I've just been using that one, and so I haven't really been on the hunt for ones that would do a good job as a replacement with fewer amps. But I think RJ Ronquillo has like a smaller one that looks pretty hip, so maybe ask him about what he's using. Looking to mix and match. Oh, okay, I think this is the one we just answered. Sorry. Okay, this is from Vince. Are there any major benefits to wet, dry, wet? Well, I would say that basically what a wet, dry, wet rig was in the 80s was a stereo rig. In the really early versions, they were just loading resistively the dry amp, and then they were bringing in the clean signal with all of the wet effects. And the reason that they were doing that, there was 2 primary reasons. One of the reasons is that all of the processing effects that they were used to using in the studio were all 100% wet. So they only were return only. So they had no dry in them. And so they needed to use parallel mixers in order to get the dry signal back in with the 100% wet effects, because they were really designed for a mix bus. They weren't designed like pedals that already have the dry signal in them. So that was one of the reasons, is they wanted to use the familiar effects that they had been using in the studio to process guitar, like Eventide and Lexicon, etc. And they wanted to be able to have their own sort of mobile recording rigs that had all the equipment that they were used to using. The other thing, that the reason that they used it, is that you could, if you had a wet cab or 2 wet cabs and your dry center and you're miking all of them, the producer could always change the wet sound after the session, or could reamp it, because they would always have a dry reference that had the dry sound, and then the outside cabs were 100% wet, or maybe had some dry in there too, depending on how they did it. But if they didn't like how the guitar player, the studio musician, decided to process the sound for the song, they could always have that dry reference. They could reamp it, or they could do their own processing after the fact. And this is before they had Pro Tools or anything like that. So they couldn't just use effects in the box and then just decide, okay, we're not going to print that. And this would allow them, they could be recording to tape, and they would always have the dry sound, and they wouldn't have to use the left and right processing sounds that had all the chorus and the delay and the reverb and the pitch on it. They could just always use the dry center, and then they could go and do their own processing after the fact. So it was convenient in that sense for recording purpose, in that none of the wet sounds would be printed to the track. They would all have their own individual tracks. You'd have the dries, that'd be track 1, and wet left would be 2, and wet right would be 3. and they wouldn't have to use the wet left and right unless they liked what the guitar player came up with. They could do their own processing after the fact if they wanted. So I think that was the major benefit and continues to be the major benefit of using that. I think the other thing is that you can blend your processing sound in parallel with the dry, and so you can blend acoustically how much of the wet processing you want versus your dry tone. So you tend to be able to get a lot wetter mixes by doing it that way because you always have the dry as your reference in the center. So I think that's another reason that it can be advantageous. But it is time for another giveaway. This is going to be giveaway question number 4. So again, if you're new here, the way that this works is I'll put the question up on the screen. The first person to answer it correctly is going to win. We got another D'Addario, my favorite capo, the Capo Pro Plus. You will win a Capo Pro Plus if you answer question number 4 correctly. So let's do it. So question number 4 is, what device replaces the power amp in our modern interpretation of the wet, dry, wet signal path? What would be a device that would replace the power amp? Now, it could be other ones than the one that I mentioned because there are plenty of things that do this. I just chose this one because I thought it was the most convenient way. But whoever is the first person to answer this one correctly will win a free D'Addario Pro Plus capo. Let's see. And Mejia will text me with the winner. Mejia, you text me 2 people, so can you clarify who is the winner on this one? Just text me again. So Mejia is going to text me the winner. We'll announce the winner in just a second. Okay, this is BWM 5150. Got it. The one that we like to use, or that I think is the easiest to use, is the Cab Zeus. This is the stereo sum or cab simulation. I think that's the easiest one to use, but you could also use a Cab M. Is another great one. Two Notes has some fantastic products which I think are really excellent, and it does have a true power amp simulation in those Two Notes as well, so that could be really cool. I just like the compact size of the stereo Cab Zeus because you can do it all in one box. If I wanted to do a true wet, dry, wet using the Cab M, I would need 2 of them. So it's just a few more moving parts, but still very excellent devices. Not a complaint about those at all. But if you didn't win, no problem, because we're going to do another giveaway in 8 minutes. So let's continue. So this is from Quinn about what time frame would justify considering your wah vintage. Well, I don't think it's so much a time frame. I think it depends on the style with which it's made. So if you got a Crybaby, generally they're making them in the vein of what was done in the 60s, and maybe they've upgraded the potentiometers or they've changed some ways that they might make it. But I would say anything that is based on a traditional wah is typically going to have these impedance sensitivities. So I hope that answers your question. This is BWM 5150. Which artist that you've worked with or seen has had the best rig? Has there been any clever surprises you've seen in them? Who's had the best rig? Huh. I mean, I think at the time, one of the cool rigs that I had done was for Josh Smith when the One Control switchers came out. And we had a pretty cool rig that we did for him that had like a very early interpretation of the battery power supply on it because he loves batteries on his overdrives and his fuzzes. That was really cool. We built some cool like interface options on there where he really liked to have like a dry bypass. So it would basically just loop in the input directly to the output if he hit that switch, and it would bypass the entire pedal board. And I really liked that as a testing feature because it always allowed me, as I was building the rig, to test to see how much fidelity it had to just going straight out, in and out of the interface box. So I could always really tell, like, all right, something must be up here because it sounded a little off. It doesn't sound as good as directly into the amplifier. So I thought that that was pretty cool for the time. I thought it was a pretty sophisticated rig given the type of gear and equipment and switchers that were out at that time. Um, but yeah, I would say that that was pretty cool. I think even on the new Paul Jackson Jr. rig that we did, there was some cool stuff there that he was doing with the stereo effects loop thing. There's also a cool rig that I did that also had stereo effects loops for Adam Hawley, who's another great smooth jazz guitarist, but can really play anything. He had something similar to Paul's that I had done maybe 5 years ago. That also kind of had some cool stereo effects loop thing that could also run wet dry or wet dry wet. Just had a lot of options depending on what amps you were given equally to Paul's. Like Paul could run it in mono, he could run it in stereo, he could run it 4 cable method. He could run it 5 cable method for stereo effects loops. He could run it wet dry or wet dry wet. So there's a lot of different ways that he could run it, which I think that flexibility is always cool. That you could show up to a gig and depending on what backline you have all these different ways that you could presumably run the rig without having to disrupt anything. This one's from Kevin. Is it better to put a true bypass tuner Peterson Strobo Stomp before or after an ego compressor? Well, if it's true bypass, I don't really think it matters. You could really have it anywhere because it's really gonna be off, all the time. So it's just like adding a slightly longer cable, maybe in terms of maybe whatever capacitance it would add. So I don't think there's any consequence either way. Um, Devin Doherty just got my modded RJM. Thanks again. I was wondering about my path out of the PVC for wet, dry, wet. I also have a collider. So awesome. If you guys aren't aware of what he's talking about, we did a special run of PVC 6Xs with RJM that were Rig Doctor specs. I think they were like $20 more than the normal one. And that was mostly just to account for some part changes and some increased labor costs of transitioning them. But the way I would do it is I would run everything in front of the amp from the PVC. And then the line out of your dry amp would then come into the collider. Collider would be controlled through MIDI because you don't need to have it in a loop because it's got MIDI. You can do all of the on-off switching, all the program changes, and all that stuff through MIDI. Stereo out of the collider into some sort of cab simulation. I like the stereo cab Zeus, but you might have another one that you prefer, or you might already have a stereo power amp. I don't know. And then from there, you would go either if you have a stereo power amp, you would then go to your stereo cabs. If you're using something like a stereo cab Zeus, that would then just feed XLR into your DAW, and you would mic your dry amp. So dry amp mic, that would be channel 1 in your interface, and then the left and right outs of your cab Zeus would be channel 2 and 3. That's how I would do it. All right. This one's from Bryce. The question is, what do you have to worry about as far as splitters to go separate amps? Is there a certain price range that is necessary? Love the channel. I have an SSS and Ultraphonics. They've been great. I'm so glad you dig them. So if you're going to do a split system, I would say really the thing that you're paying for with better ones is you're getting a better transformer. And the reason that that's important is that if you're using either a split mono system or a split stereo system, the advantage is that lower quality transformers typically will have some distortion on them and may not resemble the non-isolated output as closely. And so my favorite one is the Lely. I think that that's the best one for the money. The P-split, it's totally passive, is very good. And another one that Radial makes, I think is called the Stage Bug, and that's a little cheaper and also uses a high quality transformer. And then there's like some small pedal ones that are just splitters, but they're not really isolated. The Sur one is isolated, but the transformer is not so good. Usually there are these small little 10K to 10K transformers that are not great tone wise. So I would say I'd either stick with the Radial Stage Bug or the Lely P split. I think that those are probably the two good ones that are out there for splitting. If you stack buffers, a crummy buffer before a designated quality buffer, what would it sound like in the worst case scenario? Well, the input impedance is going to be sort of the more critical thing here. So if they're both a 1 meg input impedance and one's right after the next, it may not matter so much what order they're in, because the next one's going to override the first one, and if they have 1 meg, they're probably satisfying what's arguably the more important impedance, which is loading the pickups properly with a 1 meg input so that they react as though they're seeing the front of the amplifier. And then kind of after that, the impedance is often all over the place anyway, because you're turning pedals on and off, and they're kind of doing this impedance leapfrog all over the pedal board until it reaches the output, which hopefully you have a really good quality buffer there too, with a low output impedance, so that no matter what's going on the pedal board, you've isolated the input, the input buffer, which is isolating the guitar from the pedal board, and you got the output buffer, which is isolating the pedal board from the amplifier impedance-wise as much as possible. So you could try it both ways, but if they're both 1 meg, then it may be negligible at that point. If there's a big difference though, like let's say the crummy buffer is 500K or 250 or something like that, it may sound a lot more loaded down. Or if it's unloaded, let's say it's 10 meg or something like that, it might sound a little brighter than the 1 meg buffer. This is from Yusef. Can you do a video on treble boosters or a video on Roy Gallagher's tone? I don't know if I'm a good expert on Roy Gallagher's tone, even though I have a Roy Gallagher Strat, but I do love treble boosters. I feel like this would be a better video for Rhett Shull, because he does those sort of like deep dive videos, like what is, and then fill in the blank sound. But I will suggest this to him. I know that he's kind of he's had some delays in his production because of his injury, but I think that this would be a really good video for him. I think he could do a better job than I could. That's why I'm suggesting it. I'm not passing it off, but it's a great suggestion, Yusuf. Thank you. And it is time for our last giveaway of the day, and then I'll continue answering some more questions. So again, the way that this works, question will come up on the screen. First person to answer it correctly is going to win our final giveaway item today, which is a True Tone 1-spot wall wart. And this could be just a good, handy, it maybe isn't the best one in the world. I don't know if anybody's like, there's a great wall wart. I just love wall warts so much. I power my whole pedal board with them. I don't think that anybody says that, but they're great to have around just in case you need something. You need to test the pedal real quick and make sure that it's working, things like that. It's good to have one around. So the first person to answer this one correctly is going to win that item. So you're going to put this in the chat as soon as you have your answer. So the question is, what goes in between the send and return of a noise gate? So you could actually there's two different potential answers here, depending on whether you're gating pedals or you're gating an amplifier. So first person to answer this correctly will win. What goes in between the send and return of a noise gate? So this could depend. Are you running 4-cable method? Are you running in front of the amp? And it looks like Gear Junkie got it on this one. Mejia reports. And let's just take a look. So there could be two different ways to do it. So here's one way. This is if you're doing noisy pedals, you would generally put your overdrive type devices, your noisemakers, in that loop if it's in front of the amp. Or if you were going to do an effects loop, you would generally put it between the preamp input, which is the main amp input, and the preamp output, which is the send of the effects loop. So either of those would be workable answers, and that was the last giveaway item of today. And so I appreciate everybody who answered these questions and who participated. We really appreciate it. And if you didn't win this week, no problem, because we try to do a giveaway every single week for people that are answering these questions. So don't sweat it. I will take some more questions, and then we will transition over to our subscribing members, our supporting members. And again, if you're not aware of what that is, you can check it out on Patreon. I think it says patreon.com/rigdoctor. We have a couple of different subscription service options there, and as low as $5 a month or $4.99 a month. We also offer similar consulting over on therigdr.com. And if you look at those and you say, I can't afford any of these, you can request a free account, no questions asked. We give everybody who requests one access to it. So you can even just email Mejia right now, Mejia@vertexeffects.com. Say, Mejia, I want a free account. And he will give you the passcode to get into our private chat that happens after this, that's for our supporting membership. So feel free to do that. And again, you don't have to pay for it if you don't want to. If you can't afford any options, you can request a free account. If you can't afford it and you want to, we'd love to have you. But either way, we're good with. Let's continue, take some more questions, and then we'll finish up. So Craig Flowers, tuner preferably true bypass. I thought the Polytune was supposed to be a good tuner and buffer in one. So some of them are, and that would be an example of one that has a good quality buffer that's also a tuner. However, a lot of people like the old Boss tuners; those are not so good when it comes to the quality of the buffer. So if you have a high quality tuner that's not true bypass, or that, I'm sorry, if you have a high quality tuner that is true bypass, you can of course just use that after your input buffer. And if you have a high quality tuner that is buffered bypass and the buffer is high quality, then you can put that in place of where the input buffer would be. And we're actually doing a video that'll probably come out in a week or two, which are pedals that have high quality buffers already inside them that negate the need for buying a secondary input and output buffer, because the pedals already satisfy them internally with their buffer specs. So this might be one that you'll dig, because it'll have all the things combined into one unit, so you don't need to power any separate buffer or anything like that. Another question is there a good example of anyone using a dry-wet rig splitting the bass signal like an OC5? Well, that's really more of just a straight split system. But even if you didn't have a splitter, let's say out of an OC5 with an octave out, you could actually, if you wanted to blend in the dry or the wet, you could actually just, if you were using a bass rig, you go into your bass amp, you could do the same exact thing. You could go out of the OC5 as, let's say, the last effect. You could go into the front of the amplifier, and then you could take a line out, and then you could go out to your processing effects, and you could put those in a mixer, and you could be blending in those in parallel with the octave sound. Now, I know if you want a dedicated octave out, then you could, obviously split out and do it in the traditional way. But a lot of times people would take those and either go into the mixer directly or the front of house directly, and they would have a constant feed that would always be feeding there that then the front of house engineer would have to blend in. But I've also seen guys that will do volume pedals on those outputs, and so they can be responsible for mixing it in themselves acoustically, and they just have the front of house guy that's getting that channel fed to them. They just kind of have it up at the max that you would presumably get to in the toe down position. You're essentially using a volume pedal on that output as a mixer for yourself. And I've seen guys do that, which can be a cool way to blend it in yourself if the sound guy will will allow you to have that sort of control. Let's see. What are your favorite compressors and for what purposes? For example, MXR Dynacomp in front of the amp, or Max on CP9 for studio comp use. So I think for pedal compressors that are in front of the amp that you're using early on, my favorites are, I love old Dynacomps. I think that those are really great. Certainly an innumerable amount of recordings have been, Dynacomps have been used for. For newer stuff, I really like the Wampler Ego compressor. I think it's a really good compressor. I think the Keeleys are really nice. I like the JHS Orange Squeezer compressor is really nice. And then for if you're doing processing after the amp and you kind of want to do it more old school, I really like the Keeley. I can't remember the model name, but it's the one that I show here in this one. The limited amplifier, the GC2. That's a really, really nice compressor that's very underrated. Also, the MXR Studio compressor is very nice as well. I really like both of those after a line out. And they have quite a bit of headroom, so they can take a line level signal without clipping. So I really dig those. Um, John F. What's the best way to eliminate ground loop issues in a wet, dry, wet system? Well, you probably, in a wet, dry, wet system, if you have any issues, I would say that you could always do galvanic isolation of one of the amplifiers. Although I'd say when you're using the mixer and stuff like that, I haven't run into too many issues with it. So for the first thing I would try if you're having issues is I take something like a Lely P-split, and one of the line out box that I showed you in this, the SIR, actually has galvanic isolation in it. So you actually have a transformer isolated output of the main line out. So you could control it there if you need to. It also has a polarity or a phase control if you thought it was emanating from the line out. If you didn't have an isolated out, then you could put a P-split between the line out and the first device that's going in the line out sequence for the wet effects. And if you're not seeing that it's resolving the problem there, you could also try the isolation in front of the amp. But generally, in these sorts of systems, usually you're not going to run. You shouldn't be running into too many problems in terms of the devices themselves, because especially if you have your onboard power amp like that, you shouldn't have too many issues. So I would say if you're using an isolated line out, I think that you'll have all the isolation that you're going to need. And I'd be surprised, I mean, you have it if you need it, but typically if you are wiring it in a pedal board based system, you're not going to have the same challenges as you would if this were external amplifier returns, or if this was an external power amp, or even a racked power amp. You have a lot less areas for error, and a lot less issues with these high impedance amplifiers that you're dealing with, the tubes and all that stuff. So I would say get a high quality line out box like the SIR one. It already has the isolation on it, and I would be surprised if you need one in front of the amp, and typically you wouldn't. I'll take a couple more and then we will sign off. This is from Mick. I bought a Wampler boost and buffer. Should I put it before or after my Ernie Ball volume pedal that has a buffer in it? I would say if your goal is to isolate the impedance of the volume pedal, the Ernie Ball buffer I'm pretty sure is on the output, so I would say put it on the input before it, and that'll kind of help insulate it a little better, where you have a buffered on the input, a buffered output, and you're good. So using a 4-cable system, how do I incorporate the looper? Well, there could be a case to be made, but for this, some people I've seen put in front of the amp. The problem is that you won't have any of your delay or reverb that's in that loop. So typically people put it as the last thing before the return if they're using an FX loop. So in that way it incorporates everything. And let's do one last one. Yeah, and why does it say that I'm in Hawaii? Yeah, so I'm on vacation. We said that in the intro. So Ben, Tom, if you weren't here, yeah, I'm on a family vacation. My wife is changing jobs, and so she had this week off, and so we booked a trip, and in Maui, my folks are staying in one of the rooms, just a couple of buildings over, and so we're here for this week, and we go back on Sunday. So it's been beautiful out here. Still been able to do work and everything like that, but it's been a nice change of pace, and but I'll be ready to get back home by the end of the weekend. So I'll do one more that's not about me. um, okay, who makes the best talk box? I have to say, I did 4 rigs for Don Felder, the Eagles, and he used that MXR talk box. And I don't know if I didn't do a side by side to say that it sounds the best, like compared to a Banshee or something like that, but it is certainly the easiest to use on a pedal board. 18 volts. I think it says it takes 1 amp, but I think when I measured it, it was way less than that, like 300 milliamps or something like that. Um, and that one was just so simple. It was just so simple to use. It didn't have weird power stuff. It wasn't super noisy. And so I would almost just be tempted to say that because it's just so practical. It was just like it was just dead simple to use. It couldn't go wrong. So I would say my vote is for the MXR Talk Box. Now we're going to transition now to our private stream. If I didn't answer your question, I'm really sorry, but there's still time. What I would recommend doing is finding your question or questions, highlighting them, copying them, and then when I end the stream, you can put your question in the comment section and I will answer it over the weekend. I got a 5-hour plane ride back on Sunday. I will buy internet on the plane and I will answer those questions in the comments. So feel free, if I didn't answer your question, take this time now, copy it, and paste it in the comments when I complete this video. If you are going to be joining us for the private stream or you want to request a free membership, you can email Mejia now about that, and he can give you those details so you can join us right after this. I think we start like 5 minutes after this ends. So feel free to do all those things again. And if you want to start one of the paid memberships, head over to therigdr.com or head over to Patreon, which is just patreon.com/rigdoctor. All the options are there. You can always request a free account. Give us a thumbs up if you like the stream today. That all goes a long way in helping optimize the channel and the stream so that more people will access it and participate. And until next week, everybody have a wonderful weekend. And for all of the private memberships, we'll see you in about 5 minutes over on the private stream link. Mejia will send that out now. See you later.